What's up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with Dr. Jared Ball, and you're tuned in to episode 14 of The Last Dope Intellectual. Jab, Doc Jab. I want to shoot the shit with you today about critical race theory, okay? There's been a lot of hubbub about this, and I feel like these goofy motherfuckers don't know what they are talking about. Critical race theory just means everything and nothing, like communism, like radicalism, like Antifa. Critical race theory is another bogey. So let me just read two goofy ass tweets. The first is from Candace Owens. Now, she got a new weave, but same raggedy ass politics. I digress. She said, if you're looking for institutional racism, it exists within critical race theory. Ban it at every level. It is the new Jim Crow. I didn't know critical race theory was an institution, but I thought it was just a methodology of understanding the law. But okay, I'm gonna let her have that. Mike Pence. We will reject critical race theory in our schools and public institutions, and we will cancel culture wherever it arises. And before this, he was talking about one of Biden's, greatest failures was he abolished the 1776 commission, but then authorized the teaching of critical race theory. Now, I agree with Mike Pence that the first 100 days have been an abysmal failure, but it's not because of critical race theory. So what do you think all of this hubbub is about?
First of all, I'm very glad that you mentioned its origins in assessing racism in the law, white supremacy in the law. The obvious point is that people just haven't been reading. They don't read. They don't read the initial sort of flurry of scholarship around the issue. They haven't kept up with the debate. They're not. So they're just grabbing a catchphrase to, as you point out, I think quite rightly, to use it as the verbal boogeyman. I mean, whether communism, terrorism, Antifa, whatever, it's the same type of thing. So anything can be dismissed. And it's really, I think, a good way of dismissing any kind of institutional criticism of the state, of white people, or anything like that. So, but I like, new weave, but same old, I'm not going to read and not be involved in nuance or detail type of politics. And Mike Pence, same old white man.
That's some critical race theory interpretation of that weave. But okay, here we go. So I'm going to read, y'all know I'm a reading ass person. So I'm going to read a section from Derek Bell's Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory from 1995. Now, I just want to, you know me, in characteristic shady fashion. Some folks claim to have coined the term critical race theory. Derek Bell, in his infinite humility, said, "I don't know who coined the term, but he did it. He wanted to sort of decenter himself. I think he coined the term. I really do. But it's just interesting who claims to found movements and phrases, and who is like, whatever, it don't matter. It's the work." Anyway, so he says in this 1995 piece, critical race theory is a body of legal scholarship now about a decade old, a majority of whose members are both existentially people of color and ideologically committed to the struggle against racism, particularly as institutionalized in and by law. Those critical race theorists who are white are usually cognizant of and committed to the overthrow of their own racial privilege. Critical race theory writing and lecturing is characterized by frequent use of the first person, storytelling, narrative, allegory, interdisciplinary treatment of law, and the unapologetic use of creativity. The work is often disruptive because its commitment to anti-racism goes well beyond civil rights, integration, affirmative action, and other liberal measures. This is not to say that critical race theory adherents automatically or uniformly trash liberal ideology and method, as many adherents of critical legal studies do. Rather, they are highly suspicious of the liberal agenda, distrust its method, and want to retain what they see as a valuable strain of egalitarianism, which may exist despite and not because of liberalism. So that's the first part. So critical legal studies, of course, is the sort of Marxist critique of liberalism that comes out of legal studies. And so critical race theory is a response both to the liberal interpretation of the law and the critical legal studies of the Marxist interpretation, with that center sort of white supremacy and race, and also a challenge to the limitations of the civil rights movement, affirmative action, and other kind of liberal approaches at racial reform. So is this your understanding of critical race theory?
First of all, absolutely. Well, first of all, shout out to Derek Bell, shout out to his humility, shout out to his genius and his principled behavior, and his being kind to me personally, and his great interview at imixwhatilike.org. It's the classic joint. Please go check that out.
We will link it below.
We'll link all of that below. Absolutely. But yes, the short answer to your question is yes, that's my assessment. And if it wasn't for that sort of approach, whether it was coined at whatever time or by whom or whatever, we wouldn't get the work of people like Mumia, whose critical race analysis of the law is important. We wouldn't get folks like Ujima, whose critical race analysis of electoral politics and organizing would be, you know what I mean? I mean, we would, you know, so look, this is, again, you started off properly. These are conservative, anti-black, anti-progressive, anti-nuanced attempts to corrupt and co-opt something people are not reading and not paying attention to, and just don't know what they're talking about. So in that regard, they are consistent again, you know.
Yes. And, you know, and I think that bum-ass Pence's contradistinction between the 1776 project and critical race theory is apt. So let me read this next part, right? Because Bell goes on to say, from the perspective of critical race theory, some positions have historically been oppressed, distorted, ignored, silenced, destroyed, appropriated, commodified, and marginalized. And all of this not accidentally. Conversely, the law simultaneously and systematically privileges subjects who are white. We emphasize our marginality and try to turn it toward advantageous perspective building and concrete advocacy on behalf of those oppressed by race and other interlocking factors of gender, economic class, and sexual orientation. When I say we are marginalized, it is not because we are victim mongers seeking sympathy in return for a sacrifice of pride. Rather, we see such identification as one of the only hopes of transformative resistance strategy. He goes on to say, it is our hope that scholarly resistance will lay the groundwork for wide-scale resistance. We believe that standards and institutions created by and fortifying white power ought to be resisted. So it's also, it is an insurgent framework, right? That it's not just analysis, it's like a call to arms. And that even though this is emanating from the academy or from legal scholars, it is their form of sort of legal activism or scholarly activism that is meant to then emanate outward to inspire more wide scale and widespread rebellion. So to that end, I can see why, you know, the whites and their, you know, I won't use a pejorative term, but the whites and their bad weave blacks are hostile to critical race theory.
Yeah, right on. That's it. That just to emphasize, that hits the nail on the proverbial head. That anything that purports and in fact does encourage radical, even militant, interruptive behavior has to be condemned and rebranded.
So, but Jared, do we actually need critical race theory in a country that is no longer racist? Because Cop Mala, Clybum, and Uncle Tom Scott, Black folks, have claimed that we no longer live in a racist society, or that the U.S. has redeemed itself or continues to redeem itself from its racist past. So do we even need critical race theory? It seems like, an overcorrection if we're in a society that is no longer racist or white supremacist.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point and question. And I'm glad that those three, brilliant exemplars of Black thought and struggle have, concluded that after they have been well rewarded and funded and supported and placed and positioned, that the rest of us can lay down our arms and chill. And we can thank Derek Bell and all of those past and present for their great work. Appreciate you. But it's all good now, and a little bit of hard work and opportunity and financial literacy, et cetera, and so forth and so on.
Luck and pluck. That's all you
There
need
it
is
is.
luck and
There it
pluck.
is. That's it. And then you too can be like those like Kamala and get no support from your community for your electoral base and be selected by one or two or three, elite donors and placed in, in positions of power to tell everybody to chill. So if you just, I appreciate them. Thank them very much for that.
And it's interesting, right? This is two Democrats and a Republican.
Mm.
And so what I guess my question is, and I kind of know the answer, it's a rhetorical question, like what would make Black folks say some goofy shit like this? But also, like, as we keep hammering home on this show and on Black Power media more broadly, this is why class really, really matters.
Right.
Because we can't say that the material conditions and particular types of racial material conditions have improved and particular types of racial reward have accrued to the niggerati, right? Mm-hmm. The Black political elite. The entertainment class. And so they can, even though I know that they're making these statements, I know that they know these statements are in bad faith. They can legitimate these claims in particular ways because if we only look at them, right? If we only look at that class of people, then we might say, oh, Black people ain't doing that bad. But as we know, they do not represent the majority, right? Even though theoretically they're supposed to because they're politicians. They don't represent the majority, and the way that they live their lives day to day, the type of access and privilege, and the type of relative power that they have is not representative of the overwhelming majority of Black folks.
And even Kamala's Black father has already told her and the world that she's tripping on these issues.
But she can disregard him because he's Jamaican. He's not African American. He doesn't know the African American experience.
Because he wasn't that girl getting bussed.
Yeah, in the stroller that wanted freedom, freedom flies. Anyway, so it's just, what did it take to get here? What did it take for us to get to an attack on critical race theory on the one hand, which is really the least of their concerns, honestly? Like, it really ain't critical race theory that they ought to be concerned about. So that on the one hand, and then Black leaders, Black elected officials, Black elites telling us that race no longer matters. How do we get here?
Well, I think one of the many points or examples of the value of your work here and elsewhere is that you point to the tradition in radical Blackness, academically and organizationally, that has been suppressed. The whole Black real left, Black communist, Black socialist, Black Marxist struggles have been suppressed. We talk all the time about political prisoners and the counterintelligence program's abuse of the militant or material wing of that same kind of analysis, which leaves us with intellectually today, one of the more popular, at least nominal, critical approaches is critical race theory, even if people are clearly not reading it. So they have to attack that. These other traditions have been sufficiently suppressed or imprisoned or exiled or assassinated. So I think that's just part of it. And anything that pops up that might look a little bit threatening, has to be attacked. And then, there is a wing of the state that is already well funded, that is there to prepare and place people and to promote people to be there to say these things. So that's what I think. Just in general, anything that might lead somebody to some sort of radical conclusion has to be swung at.
And it seems to me is like a response to the massive uprisings that have been happening in the past, at least in the past year, but also certainly before that, 2014, 2016.
Sure.
And, things that are still ongoing today. And so, the Chauvin shit show / circus notwithstanding, the fact that people are still protesting the ongoing police violence, racism, material lack, racialized dispossession, et cetera, that are happening. And so in their minds, it's this kind of thought that is inspiring these uprisings. And, Derek Bell did say that what he wants is a pushback against the state. But it seems like, a reaction to or a way to further delegitimate or further criminalize and discredit the protests that are happening as a response to ongoing, racialized violence. And so they scared.
And in that way, it becomes preemptive too, because they know it's going to keep going. There's going to be more abuse to come. Yeah.
But there's nothing worse than scared white people with the monopoly on violence. It's like y'all got all the weapons, all the money. You take everything not nailed down. Why are you scared? Like there's always this fear and fear mongering. It's very strange.
And then there's always something violent and hostile that we have to suffer as a result of their fear. So you're right to point that out as well. Like the more scared they get, the more dangerous they become.
And then there's the carceral or colonial optimism of the Cop Malas and the Clybums and the Scotts of the world, where they just, I don't know if clearly they're being overly optimistic if they even believe this shit. I can't fathom that they believe this. But, then it's like this carceral optimism where things are getting better, as we move through time, Black folks we're finally reaching the mountaintop and the U.S. has overcome its racism. It's actually, that's to me equally violent just because it obfuscates what the actual conditions are. And it does make it seem like those of us who are radicals, who are in the streets protesting, who are pushing back are these wild-eyed, fucking hysterical subversives because things are fine. So why we mad,
Black identity extremists.
Right, exactly. So, this is where we're at. And it's just, it seems like each week is some new kind of, some new goofy shit. But we can't dismiss it because the right is very well organized. They're pushing policies against critical race theory and against even the 1619 Project, which we'll talk about that on the show at some point. They're actually pushing policy and legislation around this. So it's not something that we can necessarily ignore, but it just feels like, damn, we got to put energy behind this when there's so many other pressing issues that are happening, right? So
we got to break free from the carceral optimism.
The carceral fucking optimism. What up, y'all? I have such an amazing and interesting interview today with the Todd Stephen Burroughs, PhD. He is an independent researcher and writer based in Newark, New Jersey. He has taught at Howard University, the nation's top historically Black university in Washington, D.C., and Morgan State University, Maryland's top historically Black college in Baltimore, Maryland. A professional journalist since 1985, he has written for The Source, Color Lines, Black Issues Book Review, and The Crisis magazines, websites such as BlackAmericaWeb.com and TheRoot.com, and newspapers such as the New York Amsterdam News, the New Jersey edition of the Afro-American newspaper chain, and the Newark, New Jersey Star Ledger, New Jersey's largest newspaper. He served as an editor, contributing columnist, and national correspondent for the NNPA News Service, the nation's only newswire for Black newspapers. Burroughs, a PhD in communication from the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism, is a lifelong student of the history of Black media. He is the author of Warrior Princess, a people's biography of Ida B. Wells, and Marvel's Black Panther, a comic book biography from Stan Lee to Ta-Nehisi Coates, both published by Diasporic Africa Press. His audiobook, Sunshine on Cracked Sidewalks, deals with the 2014 mayoral election of Ras Baraka, the son of the late activist and writer Amiri Baraka in Newark, New Jersey. He is a co-author with Herb Boyd of Civil Rights Yesterday and Today and co-editor with Jared A. Ball, full professor at the School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State University, of A Lie of Reinvention, Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X. In 2020, Burroughs has written a full draft of Talking Drums and Raised Fists, Mumia Abu-Jamal, A Biography of a Voice, and is the editor of a forthcoming second book on Abu-Jamal, a biographical anthology. He is writing a book on Freedomways magazine, which we'll be talking about today, and hopes one day to write a monograph of Black journalist Gil Noble in his Black Public Affairs television program, W.E.B. CTV's Like It Is. So welcome, Todd Stephen Burroughs.
Thank you. I realize now that this bio has to be rewritten now because now Dr. Jared A. Ball is the founding professor in the Africana Studies department of Morgan State University. He
Mhm.
escaped communications, so I have to make sure to update that update the bio to reflect that.
But you also need to update your bio to reflect that you're the 2020 recipient of the Hubert Henry Harrison Haight Awards Hater of the Year honor. I didn't know why that wasn't in there.
But see, now that I've been checking out the Dope Intellectual, I'm almost ready to give the award back because see, you roll kind of hard there, and I like that. You roll kind of hard. And I'm really excited about this Freedomways discussion. Hopefully, Dr. Ball will occasionally jump in or stay in because I want to steal from Dr. Clarke, as I always like to do. I love the fact that when he debated the anti-Afrocentrists, he said, I'm a school teacher, so I'm not here to. I only debate my peers. All others I teach.
Everybody
right?
else I teach, yes.
I am not here to debate with anyone. I have devoted all of my adult life to this subject. I only debate with my equals. All others I teach.
And when it comes to you two and this era and all of these people involved, I mean, I almost pulled out my notepad because I'm really here to learn, right? And maybe occasionally contribute because this is a very intellectually rich period. Not only the founding of Freedomways and its development for 25 years, but also even the pre-founding of Freedomways. There are a lot of characters involved and a lot of serious independent thinking. That unfortunately we don't do otherwise. I mean, so I'm look forward to our discussion.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, Freedomways, right? So many people have not heard of this journal at all. So it was one of the most important journals of the 20th century, but we know so little about it. So can you just start off by telling us how the journal came about? Who were some of the main actors involved, and what its relationship to Paul Robeson's Freedom newspaper in the previous decade was?
I'm so glad you asked that question because Freedomways is the byproduct of so many things. So we have to kind of start at the beginning. And at the beginning, for me, is probably the early 20th century when we talk about the Crisis and Opportunity magazines, which were organs for the NAACP and the National Urban League, respectively. But those magazines, in addition to being organs, were very serious places in which people debated political issues and which direction will the Black movement take. So we have to start there, and then we have to go into the post-World War II era, in which the development of what is called the Little Magazine. The Little Magazine were these kind of quarterly publications, mostly done by white leftists. And there were attempts, many attempts to kind of create that same kind of intellectual fervor in the Black community. Now, we always had Black newspapers that had these debates in the op-ed pages. And I talked about that with Dr. Ball recently and talked about Fred Carroll's Race News. But we also had attempts at these kind of little magazines. So I'm thinking about Harlem Quarterly. I'm thinking about and Freedom newspaper as well. And Freedom newspapers is very important in terms of developing our struggle because we have to talk about people like Louis Burnham, and we have to talk about people like Islanda Robeson, and all of these very, very serious people. And let's not forget Freedomways' secretary, a young woman who wrote a play a few years later, but we know, in terms of how this kind of community developed, that she was clearly influenced by what she learned at Freedom newspaper. And of course, I'm talking about Lorraine Hansberry.
Yeah.
Lorraine Hansberry being the secretary of Freedom newspaper. So Freedom developed, and you had all of these people, including Shirley Graham Du Bois, all involved in it, and Louis Burnham. Freedom newspaper came and went. And depending on whether you believe Harold Cruz or not, the American Communist Party, the CPUSA, wanted to remain relevant in this kind of civil rights movement because the movement had begun, the student sit-in had begun, and the CPUSA wanted to create an organ for its Black members and to maintain relevant and to inject itself into the dialogue. So they freed up, in my view, and we can talk about that. They freed up the Jacksons, right? James and Esther Jackson, to deal with race matters. And Lewis Burnham was, the person chosen to be the founding editor of this journal, Freedomways. Unfortunately, Lewis Burnham becomes an ancestor between Freedom and Freedomways.
Mhm.
And, they have to reshuffle. And of course, with the great women editors, they had Shirley Graham and others. It was very easily for them to put all of this together. And you can't do this kind of thing without John Henry Clarke or John Odell. And so they all came together and created a journal. Dr. Paul, I see you. That means you're going to jump in, right? You're going to jump in. You know you jumping in.
I mean, it's a pleasure. It's an honor, of course, whatever. And you called my name. You said Dr. Clarke. You said all the right, keywords. Yeah. So there it is.
Like Candyman. I think you said your name 3 times and then you appear. So what's up? But interesting. So on the topic of the editors and the founders, there was some smoke over time between different factions within the editorial board. So for example, I was in the paper, the David Levering Lewis papers, and he had all of these interviews with various persons as he was preparing to write his Du Bois biography. And I remember distinctly John Henrik Clarke saying to DLL that Esther Cooper Jackson followed James Jackson around like a dutiful slave. And so I was like, oh, okay. And then there was some intimations that the Jacksons were colorist. And so they treated darker skinned Black folks worse off than others. And so are you privy to this kind of tea? And what can you say about the different political orientations of persons who are involved? Because you mentioned Jack Odell, who was, in the NMU, who is, I don't know if he was a member of the Communist Party. I do know that he definitely was a Marxist-Leninist, a labor organizer. Then you got, the Jacksons, who are CPUSA members. You got, and then you have, John Henrik Clarke, who is a Pan-Africanist and certainly a radical, but not of the Marxist persuasion.
Well, you two can definitely go deeper into this than I can. I will just give my own idea in terms of someone who's perused all 25 years of Freedomways. Malcolm X never got a feature article in Freedomways. He was included in a John Henry Clarke article on the new Black nationalism or the new Negro nationalism. And maybe there would be an occasional poem like Sonia Sanchez or whatever. But the Jacksons ran a very tight ideological ship. And they were only interested in African socialists and Black American socialists. Mm-hmm. So Malcolm X never made the cut, not in life, not in death. That says a lot, right?
Well, that's very interesting because Shirley Graham Du Bois was even though she had, she went to Ghana and then later Egypt and, basically was in exile for a number of years. She still was very intimately involved in Freedomways, and she had a very close relationship with Malcolm X, from my understanding. And it's very interesting, though, that he still was not included. So
the Jacksons ran Freedomways. And they got funding from whoever they got funding from. Now, again, according to Cruz, that was CPUSA. So they weren't about it. Now, one of the interesting things that happened, I mean, because you want to talk about this editorial tension, what I think is very interesting is that Esther Cooper Jackson has one anthology out, well, 2, if you count the one from the 70s, right? So she has 2 anthologies out. John Henry Clarke takes basically all of his special issues of Freedomways, and that becomes like 5 of his books. Neither book ever includes an article or a contribution from the other.
Well, I think they both are in here. This is the special issue that was prepared for W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay. I want to say they both have something in here about Du Bois, because this was built around, they did like some celebration. There's some more historical tea. Shirley Graham Du Bois cussed Esther Cooper Jackson the fuck out, about this special issue, which anyway, but, I want to say they're both in here. Jack Odell is in here. Let me see.
And Clarke
Maybe
would have been
not.
cool with the Du Boises and
Yeah, he
through their
was.
ties with
Right,
Nkrumah. So that
right,
whole
right,
thing would have made sense too.
right.
That's interesting. I didn't know she cussed her out though. That's
Yeah, I
deep.
want to hear about this cussing out. Absolutely.
Yeah, she went ham sandwich. Well, okay, it was more so they were trying to include people that Shirley Graham Du Bois did not want in there. Roy Wilkins, Rufus Clement, even Langston Hughes. She was saying like Langston Hughes wrote Du Bois out of he did a book on Great Black Americans that he did not include Du Bois
No,
in.
he did.
Imagine that.
Yeah,
and he was very sorry about that. He tried to write Du Bois and try to apologize and all that, and never got a response.
Just like Jackie Robinson was sorry for coming at Paul Robeson. No, don't be sorry. Be careful. I don't forgive him. But anyway,
Arnold Rampersad was very clear that as a full-time freelancer over his life, Langston Hughes was scared to death. And he went up against McCarthy and folded like a cheap suit,
like a lawn chair.
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
like Jackie Robinson.
No, absolutely, and felt very, very bad about it. And it's kind of funny because it's like these people live so long and they go back in and out of vogue. Like for instance, John Henry Clarke. When I went through the John Henry Clarke papers, I mean, he tried to publish for like decades, right? And then when the 60s opened up and early 70s opened up, he couldn't stop publishing. At the same time, to go back to Hughes for a second, Hughes had like piles of manuscripts on his floor, particularly in terms of African writers, because one of the things that Rampersad talks about is that Hughes was very into publishing new writers and publishing African writers, and he couldn't do anything with it. And then, once the Black Studies movement began, all those publications went off the floor. So it's very difficult. And Freedomways was a period in which the doors hadn't fully been open yet. It was still a kind of period of time where if you go and read Trading 12s, the letters between Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray. Albert Murray writes Ralph Ellison, and he talks about how people at Howard University are laughing at this young scholar in the history department because, he's busting his ass, he's doing all this work, he's doing these monographs and everything. And what Albert Murray tells Ralph Ellison in his letter is they don't understand that when the doors open up, he's going to be the first person in. Now, what scholar were they talking about? They were talking about John Hope Franklin. So John Hope Franklin goes when the doors opened up, and he goes to Maryland and can't get a place to live in Hyattsville. Jared, how about that? And so for the assimilationists or for the integrationists, they get John Hope Franklin, and then for the Pan-Africanists, we get John Henry Clarke, who then all of a sudden can't stop writing. And A.A. Touré has done an excellent job in documenting both his curriculum work and that. So Freedomways was right around this period of time in which the doors were about to open, but they hadn't opened up fully yet. And John Henry Clarke and the other editors made sure to gather not just articles, because a lot of things we talk about Freedomways being articles are actually more speeches. Like when you look at these contributions from the African leaders, they're speeches, they're printed speeches. And that's actually great because we didn't have a forum to have a printed speech from an African leader. And so Freedomways provided that.
Yeah. So Jared, in your studies of Clarke, like what was Clarke's conception of Freedomways? Why did he want to be involved? And then in your research, did his smoke with the Jacksons or with like the Marxist Leninist, the heavy-handedness of like Marxism, Leninism come up?
It did. I did not to smoke with the Jacksons specifically, but he always had issues with, as we've talked about here, he was always seen as being too black for the Reds and too red for the black folks. So that's why, even when you were just talking, I always thought it was funny because, the last interview I did with Doc Ben, he was killing Dr. Clarke. I mean, he was clear to remind that, Clarke was always rocking with the communists and all that kind of stuff. But to see that he did not have a welcomed relationship with Freedomways, he had he struggled with them, was not a surprise. But Clarke wanted to publish. I mean, to what Dr. Burroughs is talking about. I mean, Clarke was, he wrote endlessly and wanted to publish. So he was going to, he wanted to engage, and he wanted to engage, I think, the breadth of radical blackness. So that's why you would see him want to engage with the Du Boises and the Robesons and even the Jacksons, while also staying true to the the more African nationalist or Pan-Africanist or I should say Pan-Africanist wing of the struggle. So
his articles had begun to fade anyway by the late 70s, early 80s, and then I wrote a journal article about the whole dispute in which John Henry Clarke left Freedomways,
right,
and the Jacksons tried to smooth it over as if he just got real busy or whatever. But what really happened was that James Jackson attacked Dr. Clarke publicly in the black press over a tongue-in-cheek speech he had made that Clarke had made, and basically called Clarke a water carrier for the CIA. And
that's right.
Clarke, who's recovering from a stroke, his students show him this, and he has to write this statement for the black press that explains his position and all of that, and then they formally break. But according to Clarke, when I spoke to him, and thanks to Dr. Ball, I didn't throw that tape away because I literally had a cassette tape I was going to throw away.
Can you imagine that he had an interview with Dr. Clarke about Freedomways? He was going to throw it away.
No, and Jared,
and now it's at mixwhatIlike.org, so anybody can hear it.
And it's been there for like 10 years now, only because of Dr. Ball. I was going to throw it out. But Dr. Clarke explains to me in the interview, how that kind of deteriorated, and it was, I didn't know how important that interview was, because growing up in Newark, New Jersey, seeing Dr. Clarke is no big deal. It was just no big deal. And, I heard about the house. I went to the house. I was like, I was young. I wasn't even 30. I was like, yeah, this is no big deal. I'm just talking to Dr. Clarke about Freedomways. So I didn't really understand it. Okay, one day you're going to be old and Dr. Clarke's going to be gone and this is going to be important. But Dr. Ball understood that. But anyway, that interview I have with him that you can hear on mixwhatIlike.org, talks about his version of what had happened.
So I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about so this is one of my favorite issues of all time of Freedomways, precisely because it has a special section in memory of W. Alpheus Hunton. And somebody that I really, really love is named Doxy Wilkerson. I'm actually writing an intellectual biography about him after I finish these other two books. And he has a piece about Alpheus Hunton. And so this is the volume 10, number 3, third quarter, 1970. And so I just want to know, what are some of your favorite issues or volumes of Freedomways, if you can, if you have some that really stand out. But before you answer, to your point that you made earlier, I meant to say, you're so right that there is so much in Freedomways, because in this issue, for example, Alice Walker offers a short story. And so I think Toni Cade Bambara, the first short story she published, I think was in Freedomways or some of her earliest writings. And that's true for many of these Black fiction writers. And so there's a lot of poetry, there's short stories, etc. But anyway.
Now Freedomways in
Todd,
the 70s.
Todd, real quick, don't forget to drop your Doxy Wilkerson gem for Dr. CBS that you mentioned the other day. You had a gem for her to follow up on.
You have to do it.
I don't even remember what I said about
my
Dr.
God.
Wilkerson. I think it had to deal with the people's voice, but I was still laughing over what Dr. CBS said on Remix the other day when she said, "Don't trip, chocolate chip." I've been laughing about that for like 2 days, right? So my brain is more on don't trip, chocolate chip than what I said about Doxy Wilkerson.
Oh my God.
I also had the chance to to talk to people like Marvel Cook. Now this is something I also lost when I actually went to Edgecombe and talked to Marvel Cook for about an hour about the people's voice, which also we could also include in this kind of pre-Freedomways type discussion. And it was really weird because when I went to Marvel Cook's house, I saw this magazine she had in the corner. It was called Freedomways, and I had never heard of it, never seen it before, and I didn't know what it was. So, but Doxy Wilkerson, I think I mentioned, was a part of the People's Voice. And when the People's Voice went very left, when it kind of became into kind of a proto Freedomways, that's when Adam Clayton Powell had to drop it, because by that time he was in Congress. The purpose of the paper was to get him generated, information and excitement and hype to get him in Congress. And then of course he had to immediately deal with the Cold War.
I want to say Max Yergin, that's around the time Max Yergin flipped too, who was also involved with People's Voice. Right. And pushed.
Right. But to get to what you said about Freedomways, I think it's very important to point out that before Freedomways became a white magazine, which it did in
Wait,
the
what?
80s.
Okay, we gotta
Oh,
circle back to
let's
that.
not be confused. They took Negro out of the masthead in those later issues, those late 70s, early 80s issues, where it was like a quarterly digest of the freedom movement. And you had people like Lenny Brenner and all those people writing for Freedomways. That was in the last few years.
So was that the CPUSA just coming out from, being more overt in its involvement?
I think they were responding to Reagan. I really do. And I mean, so
you're right.
So
that happened in 1970, because this one says a quarterly. This is site 64. It says a quarterly review of the Negro freedom movement, and in 1970s it says a quarterly review of the freedom movement. So that was already happening in 1970. So anyway,
right, yeah, and see that 70s period. Thank you for that. That 70s period is very important because Freedomways became in vogue. Right. So in the 60s, they would write about James Baldwin. In the 70s, James Baldwin was on the masthead. In the 60s, they would write about people like Angela Davis and those folks. And by the 70s, you had Angela Davis and all Alice Walker, and all of these artists now are claiming Freedomways in the 70s because now it's become the in vogue thing to be into. So it's not surprising to see Tony Cade Bambara and all that in the 1970s Freedomways, but not in the 60s Freedomways, and not a lot in the 80s Freedomways, because the 80s Freedomways wants to deal with Nicaragua and all these other kind of topics. And Clarke is gone, so I mean the whole African world is knocked out. Whereas if you go and read the 60s Freedomways, you read about Donna Richards, her first person analysis of being in the South. And people know Donna Richards now, of course, as Miriam Ani. But back then she was Donna Richards.
Marimba Ani, that's right.
Thank you. And so, you had all this kind of SNCC analysis, from first person SNCC analysis in the 60s issues. But then in the 70s, they kind of smooth out and deal with special issues like on media. Like they have a whole special issue in 1974 about media, where they talk about Shaft and all these other things. Some guy named Gil Noble writes an article about who controls media information. So the magazine goes through these kind of periods, depending on the decade and depending on who's editing it. I mean, there are many consistent people, of course. We've got to mention Ernest Kaiser, who indexes all of these books. Every time books come out in Africa, he indexes them. Augusta Strong was one of the, basically perma-lancers at Freedomways until she becomes an ancestor. And of course, it goes without saying that when Dr. Clarke was most involved in Freedomways, he wrote about 200 book reviews. I mean, he and Kaiser were just doing a book review of the book review of the book review, which is why Dr. Clarke had this encyclopedic knowledge of all of these books in the 70s, because he had read so many of them, not only for Freedomways, but as Ahaturi points out, Dr. Clarke was also a columnist for the Associated Negro Press. And that's one of the similarities he has with Martin Luther King, because Martin Luther King was also a columnist for the Associated Negro Press. So
it's also why, by the way, that in that same debate you all referenced earlier, Dr. Clarke could say things like, you all are confessing what you have not read by what you say.
Well, what it reminds me of is Hubert Harrison, because Hubert Harrison reviewed like so many books. He like reviewed many books. And like, they weren't just like, this is what the book said. They were also like many articles in and of themselves. So that's the genre of book review now is trash, but well, coming out of academia, but that genre of, I think, book reviews is really interesting.
People have given up on book reviews because they take a lot of time to do, and they don't pay, or they don't pay well. And people would rather, do their scholarly articles and do their books and do book reviews. Dr. Ball will tell you, I've been doing book reviews on my blog since my blog started back in like 2005 or 2007 or something like that. And the serious book reviews I now put on imixwhatilike.org. So now, as I've told him privately, I'll say publicly, one of my legacies now, strangely enough, will probably not be Mumia as much as it will be, okay, I wrote all these book reviews. And these book reviews to me are very significant because, I mean, we met Frank Wilderson because of a book review that I had written. And because, I said to Jared when we were at Morgan State, I said, you got to read this book. You got to read this book. And he read this book.
Incognito.
And,
and all it's been doing is causing me trouble ever since. Hey, but But listen, just very quickly, this nonsense about your legacy being the book reviews won't hold after people actually read your forthcoming work on Mumia.
Period.
So we need to cut that out immediately.
Yeah, and your legacy is actually up to us and not you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, Dr. CBS. You don't have no say in your legacy.
So what did you say?
You don't have a say in your legacy.
Your legacy is up to us and not you. It's up to the people who shape your legacy and not necessarily you. So it'll be whatever we remember it for.
Oh, then
so
then I think we all in trouble, but we're gonna move on from that. Because I mean, with this post-literate society we're in, I mean, and it also made me think about, you know, what you guys are doing with Black Power Media, because, you know, maybe Dr. CBS, you're right. I mean, if the legacy is what the people say it is, I think that having this kind of broadcast trail of breadcrumbs is going to assist people the way I'm sure Freedomways assisted others in terms of finding the Black left.
Yeah, for sure. So to circle back to the initial question, that we kind of had a meandering conversation, which was excellent. I'm so glad we did it. But favorite issues of Freedomways, is there any that stick out in your mind?
See,
now, and I want you to pick one from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because you kind of drag the 80s.
No, it's so sad because I'm just so parochial, right? I mean, if you ask me, a Clarkian, what are your favorite editions of Freedomways, I'm going to say Dr. Clarke's issues. I'm going to say the Harlem issue. I'm going to say the Du Bois issue. I'm going to say, you know, those kind of things. Although I will say that probably my favorite issue that wasn't done by Dr. Clarke was done in the 70s. That special issue on the Caribbean, I thought was very significant.
Who was in that one?
I have no idea. I do not remember at all. I do not remember at all.
Okay, I was thinking that you might have, I wasn't trying to put you on blast. I was just thinking you might have had some encyclopedic knowledge too, because you said you've gone through all of them. I've gone through probably some of them, because you know they're digitized. As you, surely you know that there's a whole digital archive, which is where I mostly access them. I only have a handful of hard copies, but
actually, I did not know they were digitized. I'm very excited to hear that. So I'm going to love that link you're going to send me.
I will.
Because I have an unfinished Freedomways manuscript that I'm probably never going to finish unless I find a co-writer. But being able to say to a potential co-writer that it's digitized will help. Believe it or not, Dr. CBS, I didn't know there was a digitized archives. I literally went to Seton Hall University and scanned every single issue of Freedomways. I lost one of the flash drives. So I lost all of the Freedomways from like 1978 to like 1985. But all the other ones I have scanned on a flash drive.
Yeah, that's something I at some point would like I would get a student researcher to do it. I'm not doing that shit, but they could do it. I mean, you know, but there is a digital archive. The problem is that you can't download PDFs. You literally have to stay on that site and like go through. And so I need PDFs. But with Freedom newspaper is also digitized through the Tamament.
Right.
You can download those whole issues. So that's what I need.
I remember being at the Tenement when the Jacksons donated their papers there, and there was a big ceremony, and I went, and Angela Davis showed up. And back then, this was her pre-retirement days. So like seeing Angela Davis was like a big deal back then because it was so rare to see her. Now she's kind of ubiquitous. But I remember that ceremony. I remember Angela Davis going up to the Jacksons and saying, "It's me, Angela," so they could hear her, know that it was her, because they were very up in age. And I mean, I have incredible respect for the Jacksons, but again, as a Clarkian, there's always like a huge asterisk that I put by their names because of the way they treated Dr. Clarke. But speaking of treating, go back to this cursing out thing. I want to hear that story.
It was just I think I finished it. It was just mainly like Shirley Graham Du Bois didn't want a whole bunch of people involved in the special issue. And she was saying like Du Bois is for the ages. He's a giant. He doesn't need pygmies to try to bring his legacy down in size. Because what she was saying was that they were trying to, I actually wrote about this in my article on Du Bois, the one, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Traditional Radical Blackness. But anyway, like she was talking about how these people were trying to sanitize or liberalize his image, and he didn't need them to do that. And so if that's what they were going to try to do, she also has sent a to be read at Du Bois's memorial service, he had written something. And instead of them reading what he had written, like James Baldwin read something that he had written, and she was fucking mad. Like, James Baldwin, we don't need that substitution. Like, James Baldwin. Like, she was really, really mad. There were caps lock. She was misspelling shit.
Wow.
Anyway, that document is in the Bernard Jaffe papers and in the Shirley Graham Du Bois papers. So anyway.
That's fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic.
She was mad. And then actually Clarke wrote back to her. He was very very obsequious. He was involved in that because he he's one of the co-editors of this thing. He was just like, well, he was trying to sort of like palliate or calm her down. But it was, so it's an interesting exchange. I'll send them to you.
It's interesting that the short story that John Henry Clarke wrote about, going to like Du Bois's birthday celebration or whatever. And he kind of wrote this short story in which he was not very subtle in terms of who he was critiquing and attacking in terms of the kind of phony celebratory of Du Bois. Because as Du Bois himself said, and I learned this in David Levering Lewis, he said, if I had died at 50, I would have been hailed as a legend. But at the age of 75, my death was practically requested. And the fact that he lived 20 years after that and became more radical, even in those 20 years, says a lot about Du Bois.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to think about because, Clarke hated Herbert Aptheker. I don't know if he hated him. That might be strong, but they had a lot of beef because this comes out in the correspondence too, that he was writing to Shirley Graham Du Bois that Aptheker was not doing what he said he was going to do. But also there was a lot of smoke around Aptheker by even Blacks in the Communist Party in general because of how he became the Negro historian. Right. So I thought that maybe Clarke would have taken exception to that too. And indeed, when he's doing this interview with David Levering Lewis, he talks about how Herbert Aptheker was trying to read Black history into this sort of Marxist framework and was misrepresenting things. I think CLR had that critique too. CLR had that critique of Herbert Aptheker. But anyway, any insights about Clarke and Herbert Aptheker?
I was going to say Bettina had the last word on her father. So
yeah.
Yep. Uncomfortable silence. Okay, so.
But it's like,
look it up, folks. We're not talking about it. Look it up.
Oh no.
We're not talking about it. Look it up. But I mean, I could see that since Aptheker, published his multi-volume work, and Dr. Clarke was just basically getting on his writing boots in terms of book contractors and people, book contract folks wanting to come to him, because I mean, when you think about how John Hope Franklin said that he turned down doing From Slavery to Freedom so many times, Mr. Knopf came to him and literally like almost begged him to do it. And while Dr. Clarke was struggling to try to even just get words out.
Well, John L. Franklin is a great historian or whatever, but I will never forgive his critique of Black studies and him say, he was very critical of Black studies. He never wanted to join it. They tried to recruit him. He was like, fuck no. And he disparaged the project along with like Roy Wilkins, along with what's his name, Eugene Genovese, along with W. Arthur Lewis, scrub. Who I actually have an affinity for W. Arthur Lewis for other reasons, but like all of these, like he came out with them against Black studies, and so I had to take exception to that.
All of the people you mentioned, I think, offered. Sorry, I just was going to say, all the people you mentioned offered something valuable to historical study on some level. But it's that political position that they were taking that's the problem. You're right about that, absolutely.
I don't think Eugene Genovese offered much. Sorry about that.
And I think both of your points are important to make because when we deal with Howard dismantling the classics department, I mean, I don't want any idea, right, to be taken off the table, right? I don't want anything dealing with ideas to be taken off the table. Yeah. So I don't like the fact that they've dismantled these classics departments. But at the same time, these classics can produce an Angela Davis on one end, but these classics can also produce a Ralph Ellison on the other end. A Ralph Ellison literally worships the Western canon and fights his entire life to gain some sort of imaginary entry into it, which he had gotten back with Invisible Man. But like he couldn't deal with the fact that according to Western writing philosophy, you're not a novelist if you just wrote one novel, which is just a ridiculous idea. But he wanted so badly to be in that white canon. And I mean, Rampersad just tears him apart in the biography on Ralph Ellison. You know, when I think about things like that, then I'm not that sad that the classics department is being dismantled.
He missed me with "I tried to be a communist." That was a no for me. So again, nobody has to be a communist, but to be an anti-communist is anti-black. Like we have to understand this explicitly. It's the same shit with Richard Wright. Like anyway, that's a different story for a different day. But I like Invisible Man. I especially like it on Audible. It's read by Joe Morton. It's actually really good. But anyway,
if I was still reviewing books instead of trying to work on Mumia stuff, I would look into that brand new book that Richard Wright's daughter just put out. I'm very, very fascinated about that.
I don't read fiction, so.
Me neither. But I would make an exception. I would make an exception probably in Richard Wright's case.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Jared?
I was just going to say there was a great article some years ago by Ishmael Reed about specifically where he talks about being at a cocktail party and talks about Ralph Ellison and how Ellison's place was sort of positioned to a point. I learned from you, Dr. Burroughs, years ago. You were really the first person I came across in my life that sort of encouraged this thought about the white sponsorship of our favorite Black writers and artists and thinkers, so there is this contradiction of a lot of great work we're only aware of it largely because of white sponsorship, whatever we think of it, wherever we conclude about their politics. So anyway, that was one of Reed's points about Ellison, and that was one of the traps that Reed was trying to point out that if I remember correctly, that he felt Ellison fell into.
Well, being that Ellison was chosen first, I mean, he felt no one was second. So when you read Rampersad's really strong, well-documented takedown of Ellison, I mean, Rampersad doesn't miss one negative thing that Ellison has said about another Black writer. And he has not missed one thing that Ralph Ellison could have done for a Black writer and decided not to do. So, for instance, when you talk about Ishmael Reed or whatever, if I remember correctly, there was a point where Ellison would be at a party or something, and he would see somebody like Ishmael Reed and go, "What are you doing here?"
I believe Reed recounts something like that in that article.
It's in Rampersad, and he refused to help any other Black writer, including Toni Morrison. He thought Toni Morrison was parochial. I mean, so this guy had a real issue with "I am the one, I am the only one." In fact, really, when you go really deep in the Rampersad, Ellison only thinks that Romare Bearden is worthy because of his talent level, because he doesn't even think Romare Bearden is an intellectual. But he's like, "But I'll hang with you because you're a cool artist." Right. So this is how elitist that guy was. And that's the Western canon.
So I don't actually have any more questions, but what else do you want to leave us with about Freedomways and about your book? Like, why do you think it's important to even be writing a book about Freedomways right now?
Well, again, writing a book about Freedomways is in the past tense. Right? I was writing a book about Freedomways. I keep it in my bio just to kind of mess with myself, right? But let's pretend one day I'll find a co-writer and finish this, right? So let's pretend, and I'll just say this. The Little magazine is a very important part of post-World War II literary life. It's so important that even mass magazines like the Paris Review and, believe it or not, the Playboy Interview was started because of the intellectual tradition of the Little magazine. That's why Hugh Hefner wanted it. He wanted to raise the stakes for Playboy in terms of making it a literary intellectual magazine. So the Little magazine, I think, occupies a very important part in the life of American letters. And Freedomways is both the Black representative and the left representative of that tradition. Now, we could also include Black World in that tradition, but Black World didn't really last long enough to make an impact. And, we can love Hoyt Fuller and still say that, I've never seen a copy of First World. I'm assuming, there's a few around, but I mean, it's not the same impact. So Freedomways is an excellent representative of Black leftists defining what the movement means for themselves. And again, doing what the Communist Party wanted them to do, which was to inject their worldview into the integrationist versus Black nationalist dichotomy. And I think Freedomways giving that kind of third vision is where its legacy lies.
What about the Liberator magazine?
You guys go on that. I haven't read it yet. You guys go on that. You guys know more than me.
Yeah, I don't know much about it. I know Chris Tinson wrote a book about it, the Liberator magazine, but I just
haven't
know
read
it
it yet, but it's on the list.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, where can we find your work? So you mentioned imixwhatilike.org. You mentioned your blog. Where else can we look for your work?
I think that's it right now. I think I am pretty much. I mean, I might do some medium pieces at this point, but I like having homes, right? And so my homes are my blog, Drums in the Global Village, and imixwhatilike.org.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Todd Stephen Burroughs. It's been such a pleasure. You are like Encyclopedia Black. That's what I call Eugene Puryear, and it pertains to you too. So appreciate you. Thanks so much for coming on.
No. I'm glad to be schooled by the two of you because, again, I mean, you guys really went deep in terms of the study of these people. And I think it's important, being that there's so much of the Black community that is determined not to have a political imagination, right? It's a choice to not have a political imagination. I think the work that you guys have done and are continuing to do, both in terms of historically and currently, is very important to allow us to try to, again, have a political imagination. So thank you two so much.
All right, y'all. So for this segment of In Review, where I review books, articles, blog posts, etc., I actually want to focus on a special issue that just dropped, for which I was the guest editor. Yes, shameless plug, sue me, okay? And this is called Claudia Jones, Foremother of World Revolution, and it is a special issue of the Journal of Intersectionality. And this is actually volume 3, number 1, summer 2019. Most of you might be like, but it's spring 2021. Yes, it is, because this thing took a long time to drop, but I digress. So the idea for this special issue actually came out of a panel I organized for this symposium held by the Association of Black Women Historians. And the symposium was called Our Foremother's Keeper. So I organized a roundtable with myself and contributors to this volume, Jifeng Liu, Denise Lin. There was another fellow called Darif Chavanez who was involved initially but dropped out because the special issue took so long to come out that he published his article elsewhere. And then it was chaired by Robin Spencer. So out of that roundtable, we were like, oh, we should publish these pieces somewhere. And so Jesse Benjamin, who is the editor of the Journal of Intersectionality, said, oh, I'd be happy to publish it. So we began to work with him to turn our conference papers into journal articles and then to put together this special issue. And so it actually includes currently I wrote the introduction to the special issue. That's what the guest editor generally does. It includes an interview with myself and Carol Boyce Davies about the way in which she compiled and then deposited the Claudia Jones collection and the Claudia Jones Memorial Collection at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. It then includes 4 articles, one by Lydia Lindsay, who is an OG Claudia Jones scholar, one by Jifeng Liu, one by myself, and one by Denise Lin. And then we have an afterword by Dale Gore, who is the author of Radicalism at the Crossroads, which is an amazing book, which alongside Eric McDuffie's Sojourning for Freedom is one of the formative books of my own research on Black communists generally and Black communist women particularly. So I just want to go through and briefly read the abstracts for the 4 substantive articles, because I think they're all really interesting and take up a different aspect of Claudia Jones's life. If you don't know who Claudia Jones is, please just Google her. I feel like everybody who up in here will know who Claudia Jones is. You have at least heard her name, not least because of the recently formed Claudia Jones School for Political Education. But, Carol Boyce Davies has a biography of Claudia Jones called Left of Karl Marx. She also put together a collection of works called Claudia Jones Beyond Containment. They're Claudia Jones's theoretical writing. So Claudia Jones is out here. She's in our political imaginary at this point. And so, but let me just read the abstracts for the different articles that are in this special issue. So Lydia Lindsay wrote an article called Red Monday, The Silencing of Claudia Jones in 20th Century Feminist Revolutionary Thought. And the abstract says, the Cold War muzzled Claudia Jones's voice, one of the most significant women of the 20th century, but the rediscovery of her writing and activism offers us new challenges to understanding her epistemology in the 21st century, especially in regard to superexploitation and tripartite sense of oppression, both of which are at the root of intersectionality. The concept of tripartite oppression is intergenerational. In recent years, Jones has been credited with popularizing the idea of triple oppression of Black women based on their race, class, and gender, but Louise Thompson Patterson used the term in an essay in the same year that Jones joined the Communist Party. Patterson appears to use the term triply oppressed in reference to reforming the conditions of domestic workers, whereas Jones's writing and activism connected tripartite ideology to the peace movement. Jones linked the question of race, class, and gender to anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and anti-fascism into a singular struggle to attain peace that would create an egalitarian society, which makes her the mother of global revolutionary thought. The concept of triply oppressed is not static. It embodies a degree of dynamism as it situates in the context of time and space, so that in the 21st century lexicon, the concept is expressed in terms of intersectionality. So that is Lydia Lindsay's piece. Jifeng Liu wrote a piece called Decolonization is Not a Dinner Party, Claudia Jones, China's Nuclear Weapons and Anti-Imperialist Solidarity. And the abstract for that piece says, this article examines Claudia Jones's view on nuclear weapons and her attempts in the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian Caribbean News and Renmin Rebao to link Beijing's nuclear project to global anti-imperialist and nationalist movements. In hailing China's first successful nuclear test as a major advancement in the international struggle against U.S. empire, Jones underscored the overlaps between her internationalist politics and Beijing's militant foreign policy pronouncements to drive home the need for intensified resistance against imperialism and for national liberation. In this way, she also rejected the Soviet doctrine of peaceful coexistence and articulated a peace politics that emphasized the dismantling of imperialism and colonialism as the prerequisite for lasting peace. Her journalistic efforts to wage a global decolonial struggle culminated in her reporting on her 1964 visit to China, where she found evidence for Beijing's anti-imperialist commitments. Although she constructed romanticizing, if not entirely counterfactual narratives of Chinese socialism that corresponded to the party state's geopolitical and domestic aspirations, she downplayed the implications of the deepening Sino-Soviet split, thereby formulating a relatively independent position that differed from Beijing's line. Jones's activism around the issue of nuclear weapons, as well as its inconsistencies and contradictions, exemplified the hard work that Black internationalists had to put into forging transnational solidarities, tilting the global geopolitical balance in the favor of the decolonizing world. Then there's my piece, Claudia Jones, A Long Array of McCarthyism and the Threat of U.S. Fascism. And because this is my piece, I'll just briefly say that this piece looks at the ways that Claudia Jones, alongside other Black communists and leftists in the tradition of radical Blackness, analyzed a particular brand of U.S. fascism that was rooted in warmongering, Jim Crow, imperialism, and anti-Blackness. And I draw on Jones's writings, but also other writings to sort of make this case, looking at both the immediate post-World War II moment, but starting with the interwar period. So that's what my piece is about. And then finally, Denise Lynn wrote the piece, Women Crusade for Peace, Claudia Jones and the Cold War Peace Movement. And the abstract says, after World War II, peace became a central tenet of the Black freedom struggle, but it was also a liability to be associated with peace because the Soviet Union was a major advocate of the peace movement during the Cold War. Claudia Jones, a communist leader and a theoretician, was an outspoken vocal advocate for peace. She argued that war and nuclear weaponry were capitalist tools to limit freedom struggles, contain non-white populations globally, and undermine women's liberation. She argued for women's leadership in the peace movement and advocated a gendered internationalism. Jones, an immigrant herself, believed that American women should advocate for peace beyond national boundaries to secure their own independence, freedom, and equality. This was a particular imperative for Black and colonized women who, Jones argued, were the most oppressed strata. In order to free all working people and secure a global alliance, women had to become leaders in the peace movement. She saw peace as a necessary prerequisite to undermining capitalist power and to reach the full potential of a socialist state. Her advocacy and leadership in the peace movement came at great personal cost. Jones would be arrested, convicted, and deported for her determined political advocacy. All the while, her health declined, leading to her premature death. This article argues that Jones's gendered internationalism and peace were central tenets in her vision of a socialist future. So those are the four sort of new research articles. And then in Dale Gord's afterwards, she puts our pieces in conversation and talks about how we might take up Claudia Jones's work now. So that is our special issue, Claudia Jones, Foremother of World Revolution. I hope you all check it out. It is located on JSTOR. We will put a link in the show notes. And importantly, it is open access, so anybody can access it at any time. And just, a little bit about putting together a special issue. It's a great opportunity to sort of gather together different scholars who are working on a similar issue, and to sort of put your kind of leadership or spin on a particular topic. It can get a little bit difficult because you don't necessarily control the time frame, because there's a larger editor who is over a journal. You can't necessarily control the time frame. You got to stay on top of people to get their stuff in on time. You have to get people to do the external reviews. And so there's a whole process that goes into, editing a special issue. And for those who are sort of requesting these types of special issues, it's really important that you make sure they come out in a timely fashion and you communicate with the contributors, because especially for junior faculty members who are depending on their articles to come out for tenure and promotion, they can't be waiting years and years for their work to come out. And the communication is important because you're establishing a relationship with people who are contributing to your journal. It's very important that timelines are consistent, that they are correct, and that anytime there's a change in the publication speed, that there's communication with not only the guest editor but also contributors. So just for academics who are in the position to either guest edit a special issue or to request that somebody guest edit a special issue, it's imperative that this type of protocol is followed. And if you're contributing to a special issue or just a journal article in general, try to get your stuff in on time, be consistent with the revisions, if you have issues, communicate with the guest editor, etc. So those are just some of my thoughts about putting together this special issue. But more important than that, we really need to systematically study Claudia Jones like we study so many other people. Her thought is important. Her contributions are important. Her journalism is important. Her life is important. And so I really encourage all of you to check out Claudia Jones, Foremother of World Revolution, the special issue of the Journal of Intersectionality. All right, y'all. So we are back with another segment of the Doctor's In. We have 3 questions today. So, all right, Jab, what do we got?
So first one up from drcbs.com, quote, I've been struggling recently with organizing. I talk a lot and criticize my college a lot. When I talk to my other classmates on getting together to do something on our campus and see it connected to a larger struggle, it goes nowhere. It bothers me. Like when I read about the formation of the BPP, it seemed like they were always reading and discussing these issues. That's what got Bobby Seale interested in what Huey Newton was saying. No one is reading here at my college and trying to deal with this long history of resistance. It also feels like they don't care enough to read. I've got a lot of the books I have. I give out a lot of the books I have out for people to read, and they give them back without a page read. If they've read, they don't know what to do with it, and much less do they want to talk about it when I offer. My professors even scoff at my readings, well, except one. He is always interested in talking with me. He is a self-defined Marxist and hasn't read a lot of the texts in the long Black radical tradition or tradition of radical Blackness. I started my political education delving into Black radicals, and I only picked up Marx and Engels later. I'm just at a loss for how to get people energized to organize. I'm starting a radical reading group next semester for my senior year through the Black Student Alliance. but I don't know if it will catch on. I do believe, though, kind of alluding to what Kwame Ture said, we need to study before we can talk about anything. Otherwise, we just be talking out of the side of our necks. I don't think that's enough, though. So, long story short, how can I take these people into a next step and thrust us into a struggle for attending to the needs of our community? How do I organize effectively? Because I'm at a loss, but I think that my skill set is talking about these broader theoretical positions and bringing them to our everyday lives, end quote.
Whew, that's a big question.
Big question.
I would say, first of all, like, relationships are key. So, Jared, something that you said that really resonates with me is something to the effect of, like, we're not trying to flip everybody. We're trying to shore up our own forces, right? So, like, one way to summarize that is, like, our politics are for the already converted. So what you want to do initially for the initial step is look for like-minded individuals, and don't try to proselytize hundreds. Get your squad up, get your 4 or 5 or 10 people and start there. And once y'all start reading together and studying together and doing events, other people will be interested. And even if it's just 3 of y'all or 4, the numbers don't matter. It's the ideological development. And again, once people see that you're doing stuff and you're talking about interesting things, they will then be more inclined to join. And so you also don't want to be like a pest. If you gave somebody a book and they didn't read it, it's not for them. They're not, they not gonna be on that. You know what I'm saying? And so you also might want to think about incorporating, initially starting with, like, why don't we listen to a podcast? Why don't we watch a webinar and start from there? And then pick match some shorter books or articles initially to something that's more accessible, like a podcast or whatever, that feels like less of a heavy lift. So that's another thing, is that, kind of meeting people where they're at. If they don't know anything, handing them, how Europe underdeveloped Africa might be a little bit of a heavy lift. But I think that what you're doing with the BSA sounds great. Having a, political education Wednesdays or whatever is, might be one approach to doing it. And also, if you're having a bake sale, make little tiny bookmarks that attach like a radical reading list to it or something. So, like, thinking about different ways to incorporate radical reading or political education into what's already being done. One of the hard things about student organizing, I think, is that you're only there for a short amount of time, whether it's like 4 to 6 years. So, it's hard to build a movement, especially you're about to be a senior, like, you're about to leave, and so part of what you'll need to do is probably find you a freshman or a sophomore that can then continue on the things that you're doing once you leave. But I would say you're on the right track. You're doing all the right things, asking the questions, but, like, don't be like a political education bully trying to force people to do things. Like, you want volunteers, not recruits, at least at this stage. And so find your small little cadre of folks, read together, study together, start with things that might be, easier to digest, easier to get into, and then just go from there. But yeah, what do you think, Jared?
The first thing I would think is that I feel like this could have been written by me 20 some odd years ago. Because I was the quintessential overcompensating light skin showing up, talk about we got to have the revolution and here's a book, all the Afro, the dashiki. I had everything working, So one thing I think that I wish I would have done more of is join an already existing organization in the community itself and bridge the gap between that organization and the campus. I think that work, which I learned more about at the Africana Studies Center later on, I think would have been much more of value. And then I do think your advice is good. You got to chill a little bit. I think, one thing that was effective that I and some colleagues did is just take a popular movie, especially, back in the day, we would get bootlegs and stuff like that. Take a popular movie, grab some people around, get your beer, get whatever put up in the air, do all that kind of stuff. I even had an older professor tell me, Jared, you need to go have a beer with these cats. You can't just be on the 24/7 serious, and sit down. And then after the movie, you can break in, have a conversation and, bring in some politics and stuff but that kind of thing. But really, your point about graduating, and I think that's not the permanent location for organizing anyway, is maybe bridge gaps between the actual community and the campus, and encourage people to join organizations as you do on your way out of the university.
Mm-hmm. Gown in town.
Gown in town.
All right, what we got next?
All right, from Twitter, if you see this, Dr. CBS, I would love for you to talk about the discourse around being an academic and how that plays into activism/revolution, and or the idea that academics equal middle class, and that relationship with no revolutionary politics. Another good one.
It's true. I feel like most Black academics are bourgeois Negroes. But it really, so the class composition of the academy at the undergraduate level is not primarily middle class, especially depending on what institution you're at. Okay. If you're at elite institutions, perhaps that's the case. But if you're would you say, Jared, that Morgan State is largely a working class undergraduate population?
Absolutely.
And that tends to be the case in many colleges and universities. So that's the first thing, right? And so I think that for people who are in the academy, if you're teaching populations of working class students, it's almost necessary to have a particular working class consciousness, right? Everybody's not going to be a communist or an anarchist, but you have to have a working class orientation, or you're always going to be approaching these students from a deficit model, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is I just think that, it's interesting. There's at least two different dynamics in the Black community, because there is a way that very radical folks were petty bourgeois or were middle class at a particular historical moment, either because they had the means to travel, because they had the time and leisure to join organizations, or what have you. Even as they were in mass organizations or in organizations trying to organize a working class. But there is a way, E. Franklin Fraser wrote about Black bourgeoisie. There is a way that class is extremely backward and is more American than the Americans oftentimes. We talked about that in Shoot the Shit. People that deny that race is a thing because them and a couple people they know made it or whatever. And so to me, in my perspective, as an academic, I find it to be a responsibility to be to work toward being a revolutionary, right? And to embody those ethics and that commitment each day, because I do have, relative access, leisure, and privilege. And so I want to redistribute resources in all different forms, whether it be knowledge or actual money or access. So that I take to be a responsibility, but these talented 10th Negroes, see it as a privilege and as, something that they've earned as a function of their, whatever their talent. I don't believe that. I think that, and I don't even think Du Bois articulated it in that way. I think there's a misunderstanding of what he meant by the talented 10th. But I think that for those of us who are academics, who we study and write and talk shit as a living, we need to do things that matter to people. We need to do things that are relevant and that are useful and that are trying to figure out, but also create solutions for where are we and how do we get out of this shit, right? Because newsflash, we're not doing great. Shit's all fucked up out here, and I think that it's our jobs as academics, as intellectuals and as scholars to work toward betterment for our communities. And so in my case, it's Black people, period, Black people, African people. And so I think the starting point is to see that this is we're not here to just kick it and get this bag and publish these books that, that are popular, but are fucking vapid. That ain't it. We don't have time for that. And so to me, that's the foundation of sort of bridging the gap between revolutionary politics on the one hand and academia, which is the intellectual arm of the state on the other hand. But what's your perspective, Jared?
I think a lot of what you said is right on point. And I admit that in particularly in this moment, I'm almost captured by my own, experience within the academy. So I end up almost overemphasizing the opposite experience, which I think is not stereotypically given credit for. That is the amount of particularly Black academics who do have a concern for their community, who do have an anti-middle class perspective, but who are suppressed and in many ways abused by these very non-revolutionary institutions. So I get on the one hand where there is a tendency and a necessary tendency to be to demand more from Black academics, to be critical of Black academia, but I think there is an equal tendency to not appreciate what actually goes on within the Black academic experience, and to what extent these institutions and forces suppress so many of us trying to do the work that we're not given credit for. And then I'll stop here by saying we should remember that many of the Black academics who are promoted to the world, to the point you're raising, and we've made many times throughout, all of these shows, really are being promoted by the very forces we're struggling against. So I mean, they're there to be a symbol of what or to negate the work that we are all doing. So anyway, so I'm very sensitive to that, at least, particularly the more I spend time in this career. So anyway, we have to be, as you said, we have to be aware of our privilege. We have to be constantly aware of our relationship to the struggle. But I think there has to be a recognition of what these institutions do to prevent that and to limit that focus and work.
And then, if you are in academia and you do have these politics or are looking to develop them, like, squad up. That's what I always tell people. That's probably the most important thing. You got to find like-minded people so you know that you're not crazy. You're not the only one out there. People that will ride for you, write for you, like all different sorts of letters, people who will read your shit and understand it, people who you could just kiki with and complain and commiserate with, because, it's very, very important to have a network and to, we need to embody those collective, collaborative, and cooperative politics that, we believe in theory. Like, we can live our lives that way in the academy. And I think that's important to sustaining radical politics. So
all of that, periods and all of that, exclamation marks, all of that stuff.
Ampersands. All right, what's our last question?
All right, this also from CBS.com. And please make sure that you check out dr-cbs.com, where you can submit more of these going forward, and maybe end up in another segment. In a future segment. Okay, quote, I am an undergraduate student studying AAAS, I'm assuming African Studies and Political Science. I wanted to say first that I truly admire the work you do. I came across you on a podcast and have been following ever since, as well as taking notes for my own education on specific topics and readings you've shared. This may be a long shot, and excuse me for this if this is inappropriate, but I do not have many people I could ask about this. I'm applying to graduate school soon by the end of the year, and I want to contribute to and learn from a Black Studies program, and that is where I wish to apply. I have served in organizations committed to Black folks on my campus. I've presented symposium research and recently served as a TA among many other components of my application I feel confident about. However, I do not have a 3.0 GPA. I do not have a 3.0 GPA. I do have a 3.1 overall in the AAAS program, though. Do you have any advice for me as a student on how I should move forward? My current program has not supported me as well in the past, so I decided to look out into the community for advice. I understand if you are unable to assist with this, end quote.
So that's a question. So let me preface this by saying, and this is not me having my ass on my shoulders or anything like that, but like I've had a 3.8 GPA when I applied to graduate school. I won the highest GPA award in AAAS. So bang, bang. I don't give a fuck about political science, even though I double major. So I was also a double major in political science and AAAS. But so I don't, from the perspective of not necessarily meeting the criteria, I'm not certain, because I think that most programs do require at least a 3.0, 3.2 or something like that. But what I will say, just general advice, is really do your research on the programs. Choose a program based on who you want to work with, period. That is what matters. And later on, if you get multiple offers, who's giving the most money, but choose somebody, is preferably a program where there's multiple people who you want to work with, and then email them. Right? Email them and tell them you've read some of their work, you're interested in work with them, and tell them about your GPA situation and see, because doing that will help them advocate for you. Because part of how this process works is different at different institutions, but there's a committee. And generally speaking, we pick, I've served on an admissions committee as a graduate student, which is kind of why I know a little bit. Like there's a bundle of students that are picked, and then you begin when somebody identifies who they want to work with, we then talk to that professor to see what they think about the person. And then when we talk about that professor, and sometimes we're calling people from other institutions, it's a whole to do, but that person will ride for you. They'll say that, you know, even though this person doesn't have the GPA, I'm confident in their skills because of X, Y, Z. I'm willing to mentor them, help them, whatever, because the academy is as much about like kind of like the relationships and the relationships you forge as it is about what you know, in my experience. I've been successful with this horrible attitude and these radical politics because I've had people who have my back, basically, you know, period. So the other thing too, I know that there are post-baccalaureate programs for med school or for the hard sciences that help you to kind of like get your GPA up. I don't know if there are those same things for humanities and social sciences. If there are, maybe look into them, because what post-baccalaureate programs are like kind of like general ed credits that then that help you boost your GPA. They then are factored into your overall GPA. And there's different programs that are like that. The other thing might be maybe doing a master's program. It might be slightly easier to get into a master's versus PhD, and then your master's GPA will count as opposed to your PhD. The problem with a lot of master's programs is that they are not fully funded. However, I feel like in Black Studies masters, like at UCLA, I think that they do fully fund their students, and more are moving toward that model because, you know, the white guilt money and all that shit. But generally speaking, the master's programs are not fully funded. But yeah, I think that the most important thing is to just identify a program that you really want to be in, with people you really want to work with, and seeing if you can forge a relationship with those people who have really, really strong recommendation letters, have a very, very strong writing sample, make sure the other components are tight, and then, you know, see if there are exceptions to be made in terms of your GPA. What about you, Jared? What do you think?
All that is great advice. The only thing I think that I would add for consideration, and probably in the order at the bottom of the order of what's already been provided, is I think it's important to consider the geographic location socially, if at all possible. And it may even be something that buttresses, or you might consider as a balance to what is not provided at the specific institution. So for instance, if there is a community of people doing work outside of that institution with which you can build while you're in that institution in that same geographic location, it might work out that way. Similarly, I've seen a lot of people, particularly, you know, I always talk about the Africana Studies and Research Center where I happily went, but a lot of people struggled in Ithaca, New York. I mean, it's socially a brutal place, particularly for Black people, particularly if you like sunlight and stuff like that. So I think, you know, it could be, you know, I mean, it could be rough. So a lot of people, you know, I don't know percentages, but a number of people really struggled socially. And even though they might have enjoyed their program or even the faculty, it was not a good experience. So that's something I think to consider too. But all of that, I think, was good advice. I don't really have much to add to that. I think other than to really pay attention to what Dr. CBS said, because I didn't do damn near any of that. And it did not help, you know, not preparing and not doing that kind of homework, and just kind of, you know, you can luck out, but it doesn't help. So you should follow that advice.
Mm-hmm. And if you've done like some type of Mellon summer program or whatever, you can reach out to those people too to write for you, because the thing is, like, what's a little bit concerning to me is that you say you haven't had that much support or guidance. And so these are the people that need to write you letters, and those letters are really important. Like those people do get called, especially if it's like neck and neck. That's sort of when those recommendation letters become really important. And so if your GPA is not where it needs to be and you got just lukewarm letters, it's going to be very, very difficult to get into these programs. And so, you know, you may even need to have a gap year and forge some type of relationships, try to get a research position or something with a faculty member you identify. Like, I don't even know how all that works, but surely it's possible. I don't know. Everything is possible, I guess. But, you know, that those recommendation letters are really going to help mitigate against like your lower GPA. And even if you have somebody at your institution who's able to speak to your 3.1 GPA versus what your overall GPA is, how you've excelled in AAAS, that will also be like, well, the rest of the GPA doesn't necessarily matter as much because you've excelled in this way. And then even having a professor who can, who can speak to the different maybe issues that have impacted you having a lower GPA. So the letters will be important in framing that. But yeah, definitely finding a place where with somebody who you want to work with and who will advocate for you, I think is super important. So good luck. Keep me posted how it goes. Of course, I will send you an email separately, but I just thought that this was something that might be, I took the name and everything out, but this is something that may be useful for people more broadly. So
absolutely.
Keep sending your questions. You can send them to me on Twitter, Black Left AF. You can send them on Instagram, Black Left AF, or as Jared said, to drbr-cbs.com. And I will get them there. And we look forward to more questions to engage on later episodes. All right, y'all. So for what I'm on this week, I just wanted to share this little spreadsheet that I created for as I'm finishing up the text. Actually, you can't even see the whole thing. That's okay. So, but I'm at the point where, I told y'all that I'm just kind of writing in pieces and bits and bobs and following the energy, etc. But now it's crunch time. I got to turn in this book September 1, 2021. So I need to assemble all the pieces. And to do that, I just made this spreadsheet. First, I did this little graphic on top that's just kind of helping me organize spatially the kind of argument that I'm making. It's probably gibberish to y'all. That's okay. And so then the next thing that I did was I just put out all the chapters. And then I created a section for thesis, a section for questions, and then a section for some of the guiding texts that I'll be drawing on for each chapter. So these are secondary texts. I have the primary documents, but these are just sort of secondary texts that I might need to reference to keep the argument on track. And then, so for the body chapters, 1, 2, 3, and 4, you see these like black bars, because in this second row, you can't see it, but this is where I'm plugging in the different case studies. And so what I did in the first row was break down all the different arguments of that chapter. And then the second row, I matched it, or that second column, I should say. So in the first column, I put the arguments. In the second column, I matched up the different, the case studies that will be sort of, that will come in conversation with that argument. So if you recall, there are 6 case studies or artifacts or episodes or whatever that I'm weaving throughout those 4 chapters. So the same 6 things will appear in each chapter. And so I have to map out where exactly they'll go in relationship to the arguments that I'm making. So this helped me to organize all of that and to just lay out, what I'm going to be saying in each chapter and, what are the texts that I need to be sort of focusing on. And, each day I can, remember I talked about meaningful metrics. So, each day, not only will I work for a certain amount of time or words, but also I can say, okay, I want to complete a particular section. So I might want to complete, in chapter 1, I might want to say, okay, today I'm going to keep working on obfuscated abode. I'm going to keep on, I'm going to just write until I finish building out that theoretical framework, period. Right. So I'm getting organized. I'm counting the time that I have left and working back to think about how much I actually need to write each day and each week and each month. And then this spreadsheet is just helping me stay on track with that. So, easy peasy lemon squeezy. That's what I'm on. So Jared, do you have any closing thoughts?
I do. And again, starting with congratulations on episode 14, another great show. And I just want to say, I said off the record, I really love the Doctor's In segment. I really appreciate that. Even as someone at that sort of the other end of the process at this point, I think that stuff is wildly invaluable. And of course, I really dig these writing segments, the What I'm On segments, because all the things that I have not done and I know other writers are not doing that will benefit from before they do their work. Anyway, great job on that. Appreciate it. And of course, my man, 228, Dr. Burroughs in the building. That was great also. So great job. Congratulations on another great episode.
Thank you. I'm a little self-conscious about my spreadsheets because I feel like they're a little bit whatever, but it's helpful. I need to have it. I got to. So
I mean, I'm just thinking again, I haven't, again, just my own process. I just think I would have benefited wildly from doing that. And I know that others who are watching this will write books or in the process of writing books. And if they just take a moment to listen to you a little bit here, I think they will benefit, and we will benefit because it will make their work better for all of us. So
yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Appreciate you. All right, y'all. That's our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with me. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. CBS. That's Doc Jab, and we are signing off.